Thanks everybody. Good afternoon to you all, and thanks very much for joining our home working webinar. This is the second one that we've done today, and hopefully it goes as well as the first one from a technical perspective. Hopefully you'll find the next 45 minutes of real interest, and we'll leave with a further understanding of how to manage your employees throughout this extended home working period, which is probably likely to be the next 9 to 12 months. As the slide on the screen shows now, there's three sections to the webinar, with the third one, the home working study, taking up most of the time. Before we get to that, I'll go through a few introductions to introduce the panelists, but also give you a little bit of context around what we do and how we do it. And before we get to that, there's a few housekeeping rules to go through. As you're all aware, and thanks to the wonders of technology, with everyone else on mute for the moment, and we're going to keep it that way throughout the presentation, just to help with the timings. However, we do welcome questions, and for that purpose, as I'm sure those of you who use Zoom regularly will know, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So we do ask if you've got any questions at any time throughout the presentation, please do send a question in, and Mary's going to collate them for us, and we'll cover them in a Q&A section, which will be for the last 10 minutes of the webinar. So please do send in any questions you've got at any time. And then finally, just so you're aware, we are recording this session, and what we're going to do is provide a copy of that to any attendee over the next week. So you'll get an email sent out to you, so you can watch this back if you so desire, or share it with colleagues. If you don't receive that, please do get in touch with us. You can find contact details at the website arthealthsolutions.com. So to get started, just to cover off some introductions for those of you that don't know us, I'm Dr. Paul Smith. I'm Chief Strategy Officer and co-owner of ART. And I head up the business development side of the business, so that focuses on developing strategy and new products and services to deliver to clients. With me today, I've got my colleague Mary Curiston, who's a science and nutrition consultant with us, and she helps to manage different client projects, and was actually the lead on the home working study project that we've just run. And then we've got Dr. Josh Jackman, who's a principal science consultant with us, who leads our science team and project manages all projects across multiple clients. And for the purposes of today, Mary's going to give you some insights around some of the methodology that we employed during the home working study, and also help with collating the Q&A, as I mentioned. And Josh is going to talk through some of the key findings of the home working study, if you like, the more interesting part of the presentation. So just before we get to that part, to give you a bit of context, who are we and what do we do? Well, we're essentially a team of scientists. We've got a legacy in sports science, but we now focus 100% on the corporate market, with the aim of delivering and improving health and performance within that space. And essentially what we do is measure the impact of different workspaces on employee well-being and performance. And we do this through a range of different devices, and we do it with a number of multinational companies across lots of different workspaces. So we've conducted projects in traditional global HQs, in normal office environments, in flex working spaces, and obviously now in the home working environment. How do we do that? Well, we integrate a range of data collection devices and methods to specifically look at 4 different areas. One is well-being, cognitive performance is another, indoor environmental factors such as lighting and heating is another, and then employee experience is the final area that we specifically cover. And all of our tools and devices and methods that we use are fully remote, so that means we can track large sample sizes over long periods and on a continuous basis. So we're able to process and analyze data in a really efficient and effective manner. We've also got our own in-house technology to process the data and smartphone application to conduct some of the cognitive performance tests. And a big focus is making sure that the projects we run minimize the disruption to employees on a week-by-week basis. So ultimately, we collect data over a sustained period using both objective and subjective sources. So it means that our data is more than just a snapshot in time of an employee's feelings. And what we're trying to deliver to our clients is market-leading insight that gives them an idea of the real impact of their workplaces on their employees, and hopefully then allow them to make evidence-based decisions around the real estate portfolio and the real estate strategies moving forward. So that brings me on to the home working study itself. I'm just going to give you some context around the study and why we've decided to run it. And then I'll pass over to Mary, who's going to give you some insights around the data volumes and the data sources before Josh goes into the more detailed analysis of some of the findings. So the context, like the rest of the UK and most of the world, mid-March came along. Suddenly our world changed overnight. Projects that we had been running and with multiple clients in different locations could no longer continue in the same vein, with all their employees being moved to the home environment. So our focus immediately shifted to how could we support those clients, and more specifically their employees, throughout that home working period. And so we spent the last 2 weeks of March developing our solutions to enable those projects to get back up and running again. And by the end of March, we've managed to continue with all of our client projects, and we're measuring all of the employees in the home working environment. But throughout that process, we had lots of discussions with senior stakeholders, and it became very apparent that the speed at which this change to home working had occurred had left many real estate and workplace experience teams kind of reeling and under real pressure in order to come up with a strategy in the short term that would see their employees well supported throughout the home working period. And as a result of that, we decided that the services that we deliver and the insights that we can provide would be of use to a wider network outside of just our clients. And therefore we took the decision to run a free home working study that was open to any individual or any organisation that wanted to take part and understand what this home working period was having, what effect this home working period was having on their employees. So in early April, we launched the home working study using various social media platforms, and that kind of kick-started this whole process for us. And I'm now going to hand you over to Mary so she can give you a little bit more context around the timings of the study and the volume of data that we collected.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, so at the start of April, we launched the home working study, and all participants were set up remotely in a 2 to 3 week period. We had 12 organisations from 9 different sectors that took part, and data was collected for 8 weeks from April 20th to June 12th. And during that time frame, over 2,000 cognitive performance tasks were completed. There are more than 4,400 days of physical activity data, and over 10,000 survey responses were collected. So as you can see, we collected loads of data, much of it objectively and passively. And then when this is combined with all the subjective and cognitive performance data that we collected, we have a real one-of-a-kind data set that can be used to mine rich insights that go beyond a snapshot in time. And despite the challenges, we were able to set up a large volume of participants, keep the engagement levels high, and deliver individual reports all remotely. And then just moving on to the data sources. So in order to gather the data, we utilize existing third-party wearables to collect the physical activity and sleep data, and our own proprietary technology, Omics mobile app, to collect cognitive performance and some subjective feedback around the working from home environment. And then we utilize Microsoft Forms to collect weekly survey responses on either mobile or PC. And this provided us with rich subjective data around areas such as mental health, mood, productivity, performance, desirability, and just the overall experience of working from home. And then all this data was fed automatically back to our data processing system via the cloud or online, and then it was reconciled, ordered, and subsequently analysed then, following data cleaning and filtering to derive these insights. And then getting on to what you've all been waiting for really is the actual data. So I will pass you on to Josh, who will take you through this now.
Thanks very much, Mary. So as you said, here's the bit that we're here for, so the data. So just to give you sort of the framework, so I'm going to start off by kind of giving the big picture, the summary, the trends essentially that we've seen across the board throughout the study. I'll then look to get into a bit more of the detail and peel back some of those layers as we look to get a real understanding of what this all means and how it can be practically useful. So the first metric that we'll take a look at is physical activity. So as Mary's just mentioned, we collected this data from a range of wearable devices, and perhaps unsurprisingly, when we compare the sort of the home working environment to what we would typically see in the office, we saw a reduction in the steps. So we saw about 19% or around a 2,000 step reduction per day from the home working environment to what we previously saw in the office. At this point, it's worth just noting that throughout the presentation, I'll refer to sort of the office baseline, and this is essentially the industry average data that we've collected from previous projects in the office environment, and that just gives us the ability to compare what we've seen previously to our new home working data. So just to bear that in mind when that's referenced throughout the presentation. I suppose one consideration with the data that was shown there in terms of the decrease in steps is that this period of home working took place throughout the nationwide lockdown. So it's obviously a factor that's going to have influenced that. Despite that, as easing restrictions have occurred over time, and what we have seen is steps are trending back towards that baseline, but they are still below that level. So despite the easing of those restrictions, we can still see that steps are lower in the home compared to the office. So as such, physical activity, or perhaps more pertinent, physical inactivity, and how to mitigate this could well be a key consideration for those working from home in the future. And while this general trend is interesting, I think if we even dive a layer below this, we can see that there's large variations between the organisations on the figure, and then also even more so for the individuals within those organisations. So as I said, we can see from the figure here that some organisations are certainly can be seen to be much better performing than others, and I suppose highlighting really those that could really benefit from some support strategies that would benefit their employees. And then when you consider to the bullet point on the left, the top performer across the board that we saw was averaging around 22,000 steps compared to someone who averaged just 3,000. This really again enforces the importance of not settling on a one-size-fits-all approach. And I know Paul will come on to discuss some more of that towards the end of the webinar. So linked with physical activity is, I suppose, physical inactivity, and otherwise known as sedentary behaviour. So I think we can all appreciate that unless you're living in some kind of extravagant mansion, then the ad hoc trips to the bathroom just to grab a cup of coffee, and now only a few short steps away when we're working from home. So the byproduct of this really is that while this may seem more efficient and we're not spending as much time performing those activities, we are really depriving our bodies of those short but really important stints of activity. But what did the data say? What did we find? So on average, across the 8 weeks of the study, we found that each person spent an extra 58 minutes sedentary per day compared to the data that we've got from the office. And I suppose what if I was to tell you that accumulating that throughout this period, that equated to an extra 2.5 days time spent sedentary compared to that office environment. And I suppose just to reinforce, that's on top of the time that's already spent sedentary. So we're doing less steps, and we're potentially sitting down or certainly being more inactive. And the evidence is suggesting that this has major long-term health implications. So some recently published scientific papers, and one here particularly from the COVID-19 pandemic, suggests that physical inactivity can really contribute to those poor health outcomes such as sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass and strength with aging, and various cardiovascular diseases. So considering the global problem of physical activity or physical inactivity already exists, clearly some thought there is required to support employees as part of a longer term home working strategy. How about if we look at everyone's favorite subject, sleep? The two key metrics that we've got to pull out here are sleep duration and the amount of restorative sleep. So we see these on the two figures, and sleep duration is essentially the amount of deep sleep, the amount of total sleep that an individual gets per night. And restorative sleep refers to the amount of deep sleep and REM, or rapid eye movement sleep, the combination of those two sleep stages together. And they're two of the sleep stages that individuals go through per night, which are particularly important for allowing the body and the brain to really recover. So with the switch to home working, we noted that there was an increase in both the sleep duration and the amount of restorative sleep. And we saw that was by about 4 minutes. So essentially individuals were getting an extra 4 minutes of sleep, but that sleep was also restorative per night. So again, thinking about that in terms of like the accumulation of that, it might seem like a trivial amount, 4 minutes sort of per night, but when you look at that across the 8 weeks of the study, we can see that was equivalent to an extra 4 hours worth of recovery to those individuals. And that's essentially half an extra a night's sleep. So it's certainly worthwhile in that regard. And from a scientific perspective, we sleep is one of the main drivers, which is known to impact almost everything from mental well-being to cognitive performance. So anything that moves this dial in the right direction is certainly going to be seen as a positive. I think one point to draw out when looking at these figures is that we can see there in certainly the first 3 weeks there was slightly higher and more of a spike, which generally seemed to tail off by week 8, or certainly by week 8. And I suppose it's possible that there was an early novelty effect of home working. Individuals maybe felt a little bit more free to use that time where they didn't have the commute to get an extra few minutes in bed, or even potentially due to sort of working routines. But then as time moved on, the restrictions eased and things maybe got back to a little bit more of a sense of normality. Perhaps those early spikes in sort of sleep duration and restorative sleep actually sort of tailed off. So that's something to, I suppose, keep an eye on as we move forward. But nevertheless, home working across the 8 weeks of the study did go up in a home working environment, and we can certainly see that should be considered beneficial for enabling employees to grab that much needed extra few minutes of shut eye. So one of the aspects that we asked in the weekly pulse survey that employees completed on a weekly basis was to ask how they were feeling. So in particular, we asked around 6 mood constraints, as you can see on the x-axis here, and each of those was asked to be rated out of 10. So on their own, these individual scores and averages from across the period aren't necessarily insightful, but when we compare them to the office norms, they tell a different story. So here we can see the office normal data. So this is the industry averages that we took from across the board in the office environment. And when we overlay the home working data, what we can see is that for all 6 of those constraints, the data moved in a positive direction. So that being that employees, they felt happier, they had higher energy levels, they were more relaxed, they felt less worried, less stressed, and felt less anxious. And that was despite being in the middle of a global pandemic. So lots to consider there. I think something else to consider is that what we're presenting here is a group mean. And while it's certainly of value to track the general shift in sentiment, we must also consider that individuals are going to sit above and perhaps more importantly below this mean. So again, being able to dive deeper, being able to decipher how individuals can be better supported can only be a good thing to move that dial in the right direction for everyone. Another of the pulse survey questions which we asked and gave some interesting data was when we said, how desirable is your workplace? So the possible responses to this question, as you can see again on the x-axis here, range from extremely desirable at one end to extremely undesirable on the other end. If we first look at the office baseline data, so we can see that there's a spread in employee responses across the spectrum, but perhaps most interestingly on this point, no responses at the extremely desirable end there. When we bring in the home working data, what we can see is essentially a leftward shift in those responses. So essentially what that means is that in general, the home was seen to be a more desirable place to work than compared to when employees were in the office. So another key point is that if we sort of group the responses together somewhat, so if we say the top response in terms of desirability, so extremely desirable, and somewhat desirable, and then the same on the opposite end of the scale for the undesirable responses, what we can essentially see is that only 14% of the responses remained in the middle. And again, comparing it to the office data, we can see that that's again reduced from what we saw. So I suppose, to that point, you can call home working perhaps the Marmite of the workplace. Employees are going to either love it or they're going to hate it. Obviously, we want to create workplaces that employees love. And it's when we start to look at these two groups, so those that found it desirable and those that found it undesirable, that we start to piece together a story that's really quite powerful. So again, keep in mind those two groups, as that will be sort of some of the focal points over the next few slides. So as I said at the start, so far we've talked about the general trends, all of which is interesting and some of which was perhaps to be expected. But I suppose, what's the use in this data? But what I'll talk about over the next few slides is the really juicy stuff, or at least I like to think it is anyway. So it's when we start to link the metrics together, we start to see what are the predictors, what are the driving forces behind employee well-being and performance that ultimately allow us to be more targeted with our strategies and really guide the practical decisions that can be made based upon this data. So one of the areas that I've just mentioned, but I'm yet to touch on, it is performance. So, there's no getting away from the fact that employee performance is pivotal to this discussion, and that's why performance, and in particular cognitive performance, is one of the central factors to our data collection in any project. So I'm sure we're all aware that quantifying productivity in the modern workplace, where knowledge workers are less judged by the quantity that they can produce, but rather the quality of those outputs. And that's why we objectively measure employee cognitive performance. And we do this using a bespoke smartphone application, which users can access fully remotely. So they can complete it in the convenience of their own time and location. And they complete those battery of tasks, which are scientifically validated, and they measure and have the capability to measure a variety of different aspects of cognitive function. Here and within this study, we focused on 3 of these cognitive constraints, which are particularly relevant to the cognitive performance or brain power of employees, and these being working memory, their decision making, and their distractibility. So again, I'll just take you back to those 2 groups that I just mentioned before. So again, those that found home working desirable and those that found home working undesirable. And what we can see is that, well, depending on which group you sit within, it has an impact on your cognitive performance. So here we can see that for those reporting that home working was desirable, they had an improved performance across all of the domains of memory, decision making, and distractibility. So essentially here, desirability of your home working environment can be a driver of your performance. What about the impact of how you're actually feeling at the moment when you complete these tests? So each time an employee completes the battery, they're presented with a series of multiple choice questions, and one of which requires them to select their current mood state. So just to note that on these figures, we can see that the different mood constraints and the scores that we received, but just to note that the lower scores actually indicate a better performance. So that essentially means that the employees were able to respond faster to the stimuli, requiring less time, or they were actually able to also make less errors for which they were penalized. So the data here we can see shows that employees performed best across all 3 of those domains when they report in feeling happy. But on the flip side, when the employees felt anxious, that was when their performance was poorest. So I think this highlights the importance of mental state for performance, and I suppose raises questions on both sides of the coin. So for employers, how can we best support this? So how can we best support this so employees are able to function at their best? And for employees, how can we be aware of this, and how can we act accordingly as individuals to try and facilitate this? So I think there's a responsibility there together, and by implementing those strategies that are going to facilitate both employee mood and performance, that's inevitably going to be a win-win for both parties. And now just to, I suppose, bring that triangle together and look at the link between mood and desirability. So we've pulled out 2 of the key mood constraints that we looked at in happiness and stress. So happiness you'll see on the orange line, and stress on the blue line. And again, on the x-axis, you can see those desirability responses from that question in terms of extremely desirable to extremely undesirable. So as you can see, when we bring up the happiness data, having an extremely desirable or a desirable home working environment is key to facilitating the most happiness. And on the reverse, feeling that your environment is undesirable or even worse, then that's going to not be great for fostering happiness levels. And it's a similar story when we look at the stress data, but in the opposite direction. So again, extremely desirable or desirable home working environments mean that you're feeling best from a stress perspective, whilst actually if you're at the other end in terms of undesirable or extremely undesirable, then that's going to potentially foster the highest levels of stress. So while the link between mood and desirability isn't perhaps altogether unsurprising, it certainly from a personal perspective, it made me really consider how big the impact of something which maybe seems as simple as a workstation setup does have on the rest of your life. So being happier and less stressed for sure will have knock-on impacts on mental well-being and how you interact with those around you. So I think that's certainly something which is worth supporting from an employee and an employer perspective. So we think about this in a bit more detail again, and take that triangle of mood, performance, and desirability. So how powerful is that knowledge that by making your working environment more desirable, or even perhaps less undesirable, we can make happier and less stressed employees, but we can also improve their performance. So inevitably the next question is going to be, what can we do to make those working environments, and that's both at home and in the office, more desirable, and to have those knock-on impacts that will impact employee mood and performance. Well, thankfully, I'm not going to leave you hanging on that one. So in this slide, I'll talk through some of those key drivers for desirability. So again, we'll go back to those two groups. So those that found home working desirable, those that found it undesirable in their working environments. And first off, I'll touch on the environmental factors. So we can see here that of those responding that their working environment was desirable, they also, a much higher proportion of those people were working in comfortable temperatures. They were more satisfied that their surrounding noise levels were comfortable. They were getting a good supply of fresh air, and they also had access to high levels of natural light. Additionally, if we look at the physical environment, so just 2% of employees reporting to be in an undesirable setup were actually working from a dedicated office, in comparison to 32% on the reverse side of that scale. And it's a similar story there for the dedicated workstation within that office. Now, if you're like me, I'm in a flat. Unless there's some fairly significant construction work, I'm not going to be able to magic up a dedicated office space for myself. But there are some really key and practical take-home messages that I could take as an employee that would enable me to personalize my environment. And again, that personalization piece is so important, because that's clearly not something that's not possible when we're looking at open plan office spaces, and sharing those office spaces with a multitude of other employees who are also going to have different preferences. So something to really capitalize when being in a home environment. I think this data, again, it really raises questions for employers. So how can they best support their employees to improve their home working environment if working remotely? But then also, how can they inform their decision making with return to the office? So for example, we could be facing reduced occupancy situations for a prolonged period. Who are the employees who might be best placed to be prioritized to come back to the office? Or perhaps if that's not possible, who could be given perhaps local access to co-working environments, and that could facilitate them being in a more desirable environment. I think that the general point being that with knowledge of the data, solutions can be implemented, and at the earliest opportunity to any potential problems, and to mitigate that against that risk of unhappy and underperforming employees. So the last point I'll touch on is I suppose to provide some food for thought. So when the individuals had a desirable working environment, what we also saw was that they performed an extra 1,000 steps per day. Now, unfortunately, I don't know what the cause and the effect is here, but the question is certainly interesting. Are happier, better performing employees who are more satisfied with their workplace also motivated to perform greater levels of physical activity? or does performing the greater levels of physical activity actually foster a better mood state and higher levels of performance? So again, unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that one now, but I suppose in any case, knowledge is power in this regard, and taking that holistic view and being able to enable the implementation of some of these marginal gains will certainly drive happier, healthier, and higher performing employees. So I'll now pass back to Paul, who has some more kind of key points around the interpretation of this data. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Josh. Some really quite stark findings there, I think, and particularly around desirability as a potential predictor of performance, and how linking different metrics starts to build a strong picture of which variables are having the greatest impact on employees. And I think if you look at some of the general trends that Josh outlined, you might deduce that work from home has been a generally a positive experience for most employees. And my fear with that is that some organisations use that data and take no action, or take the wrong type of action to support their employees moving forward. And I think that could have some serious implications from a wellbeing perspective, because the average data from across multiple companies is quite different when you break it down to individual level company data. And so the next couple of slides, I just want to focus on that and show some examples of when you look at company and then team and then individual data, the findings start to change somewhat, and may change some of the decisions that are made as a result. So firstly, when we look at between organisation data, I've just pulled out two organisations from the home working study and picked out three variables, two of them wellbeing, one performance, to see how they compare to one another. And as you can see on the screen, there are some quite big differences. So steps has a 21% difference, restorative sleep, which Josh touched on earlier in terms of the importance of that, there's a 9% difference, and then same sort of story for performance with an 8% difference across the three constraints of decision making, memory and distractibility that we talked about earlier. And whilst you may look at those and think that's not too bad, I think when you consider that across a number of weeks or a number of months, you'd start to see quite a huge impact on those two organisations if you simply followed the industry data and made your decisions and develop your strategy according to purely the industry-wide data. So breaking it down to an organisation level and really measuring your own workforce starts to become more and more important. And I think that the aim here really for most companies and some of the clients that we work with is to try to serve most of your employees for most of the time. It's very, very difficult to serve all of your employees all of your time from a personalisation perspective. But if we can try and serve most of the employees most of the time, I think that would start to develop this personalised approach and start to eke out some of the right strategies and the right policies to adopt that may not be in line with the industry averages. And I think that's further highlighted when we break that down into teams within an organisation. So here I've taken three teams from one of the organisations on the previous slide and looked at four different variables. And as you can see, that there's a lot of variation across the three teams. So no one team in particular outshines the other. Each of them are performing better in certain variables. That the green text highlights the ones that perform the best in each variable. But I think probably what's even more interesting is when you take one particular team. So if we take team 3, for example, they're actually showing from a sleep duration perspective that they're above the industry average data that we collected. So they're doing very well from a sleep duration perspective. But actually, when we look at the daily steps, they're significantly lower than the average. And on the stress, they're showing much higher levels of stress. So with that team in particular, if we took the industry level data, developed a strategy to support them at home, it probably wouldn't be as effective as we hoped, because there are different nuances that are linked to that team that we really do need to consider. And I think to further the point, when you break that down to individual level data, so this is now showing, the graph on the right is now showing data from individuals within one of those teams and how they performed on the decision-making tasks. You can see there's quite a lot of variation again here. So four employees had a significant improvement in their decision-making performance when they were working at home compared to when they were in the office. 5 individuals showed some improvement that ranged from just above 1 to just above 7%. But then we also had 1 individual who performed worse. And what this really shows is that level of insight, whether individual, whether it's team, is really, really critical if we're going to make informed decisions around which employees are going to flourish at home, and maybe the extended period of home working will actually work really well for them, and those that actually may require extra support, or even actually an earlier return to the office when we're starting to increase our occupancies within our office environments. So using just industry level data is not going to provide that level of insight, and ultimately I think for those people that are going to have employees at home for a long period, it could cause them some major problems, I think, around from an employee wellbeing perspective, if we're not collecting that individual or team level data. So as we come towards the end of the webinar, and I'm conscious of time, hopefully you've been able to see from what we've talked about that some of those insights paint a really interesting picture of what home working was like during the lockdown period. We've provided an overview of some of the key variables, how they changed compared to the office environment when we measured them pre-COVID, which metrics have the greatest impact on other metrics, and then also looked at some differences between and within company when compared to industry averages. And so for me, it's what are the key insights from our findings to help inform the future strategy for organisations and employees that are facing the next 6 to 12 months of working at home. And there's 4 kind of key messages, I suppose, that I'd like to try and get across, and hope that some of the audience take away with them when they're planning how best to cope with the coming months. First and foremost, home working has been desirable for most people. However, as we've touched on, it's worked really, really well for some and not worked quite as well for other people. However, I think what we need to remember, and I'm sure all of you are fully aware of this, but this was a very unprecedented time. There was lots of restrictions on movement. There was lots of distractions in the house, which impacted our ability to work and go about our daily lives. So the effect of the macro force that was lockdown undoubtedly changed individual behaviour during that period, and therefore definitely impacted the data that was collected across that period. So despite our insights and other reports that have been conducted on home working, I think being very, very insightful and very helpful, I'd caution against only using this type of data to inform any future strategy around home working. Many of these insights are 8 to 12 week studies. They're on relatively small sample sizes, and therefore to me it's more about gathering further insight to help inform future decision making, and that needs to be done on a larger scale over a longer period, and also outside of the effect of lockdown, and also understanding how people's perceptions and people's behaviours change over time, and how other external macro forces actually impact that beyond the COVID macro force. My second takeaway point is considering which metrics are going to be of most use to you as a business to help your employees. So as we've shown, being able to dig deeper into some of the data can provide some really useful insight around home working and strategies related to that. And I think it's really important that organisations collect data in areas that can actually impact their employees, rather than simply collecting data to reinforce their own opinions or things that they could have predicted without necessarily collecting data. So things like personalising the home working space to ensure the right indoor environmental features are available, or developing ways of working that better support quality sleep, or building flexible scheduling to allow employees to focus on the right type of tasks at the right time of day, are all tangible actions that would allow employees to thrive within a home working environment. But those sort of decisions can only really be made if you've got the right data and the level of insight that you need. So to me, it's about collecting the right metrics, understanding which ones are relevant to your workforce, linking that data as best as possible to understand which have the most impact on each other, and then using a mixture of both subjective and objective data collection methods, so you get a continuous measurement period rather than just a snapshot in time. And then my final 2 points before we get to some Q&A are measuring your own staff. I've obviously touched on previous slides the differences that we found between and within organisations across the home working data study, and I think the next 6 to 12 months are going to be such an important period for employees whilst they're located at home or whilst they spend a day or two a week in the office. And so ongoing measurement of your own workforce as often and as frequently as possible is going to be really, really important. And employees' behaviours are going to change, so will their needs across that period. And I think the organisations who are actively monitoring and understanding what's going on are going to be best placed to react to those changes and provide the appropriate support and advice that's needed. And I think now's the time to start that process, because all the stakeholders that I'm speaking with are in the process of designing their strategies, looking at their real estate portfolios and making really, really big decisions. And if you haven't got the data to support that now, it's unlikely you're going to be able to use any data that you collect in 6 months to make a big change to that decision-making process. So hopefully, if people collect meaningful data and they do it on a large enough scale, they'll have the evidence to help them take the right path and ultimately improve the well-being and performance of their employees while they work through this home working period. And then my final takeaway point is, what does the long term hold for us? The home working period is, I suppose, reinforced what we already knew to be true, and probably lots of people on the call as well, is that workspaces impact the well-being and performance of employees in multiple ways, and being able to understand which variables have the greatest impact allow organisations to then develop a long-term strategy that will probably involve a blend of workspaces that meet the needs of the different personas that you have within your own company. The period of home working has been a really interesting live experiment, and I don't think many organisations would have conducted it if they hadn't had their hands tied by this global situation. However, the insights that have been generated have probably given us more questions than answers. And I think the next few months are going to be the pivotal time where the more data that you can collect, the more informed you're going to be. And I hope that employers jump on this opportunity they've now got to future-proof the health of their workforce, and really derive strategies and portfolios that are supporting their employees and ultimately will help their business continue to grow. I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you found those insights really useful and the findings of interest to you. We've still got some time available to cover some of the Q&A, so I'm going to hand back over to Mary to cover off some Q&A and to give us some questions to answer as we come to the end.
Great, thanks, Paul. So yeah, now we'll welcome any of your questions, and just to ask a question, just have to type into the Q&A box located at the bottom of the Zoom window. You can ask anonymously if preferred by clicking the relevant checkbox, or you can upvote any other questions using the thumb icon. So we just have a few in so far. So Tim has asked, how do you navigate GDPR when collecting such data?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and although we're not necessarily touched on it here, that is one of our key considerations with any of our projects. And I suppose that's both from an internal perspective in everything we do from an internal point of view. Obviously, we've mentioned smartphone applications and things like this, so ensuring tech security and GDPR is compliant is everything about everything we do. But that also stretches through to the work that we've done in the projects that we've done with clients. So we've worked with large multinationals where we've actually worked very closely with their privacy teams to ensure that everything's covered off from their perspective, and in doing so, that's obviously ensured that the sort of obviously GDPR is covered. So I suppose on some of the specifics is things like de-identification. So every employee or participant who gets involved in one of our studies is given a project identification number. So by the time the data we receive the data, it's de-identified. So we're not receiving any of that employee personal information. Again, things like project email accounts. So all communication will be gone through a de-identified source. So certainly important question, and something that we're really hot on, both internally but also in work with clients, and I say working closely with their privacy teams on that.
Great, thanks, Josh. Now another question is an experiment like this hard to set up? Paul, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. No, the simple answer, from our perspective, is we've spent a lot of time over the past few months making our setup process fully remote. Again, we're fully aware that we don't want to be burdening employees or teams or stakeholders with lots of time-consuming processes. So if we use the home working study as an example, as I said, we kind of decided to do it at the end of March. We started the process at the start of April, and I think I'm right in saying that within sort of 3 weeks we had everybody set up and data being collected at that point. So everything we do, from the consenting to device setup instructions, data collection, data processing, data analysis, is all done fully remotely. And one of the big things we're really keen on is to make sure that employee engagement is as high as possible, but we also disrupt them as minimally as possible. So we only ask about 15 minutes a week of each employee's time to take part in the studies. So no, the simple answer there is it's reasonably quick given the scale of the studies that we conduct.
Great, thanks, Paul. Monica has said really interesting findings. Thank you, Monica. And were you able to stratify desirability with commitments at home, such as young kids or elder care, which could have been significant influences?
Yeah, and say hi, Monica. Again, really good question, because that's something we're obviously not presented here, and I think, I suppose, just to say, touch the surface and scratch the surface with what we've tried to collate in terms of a relatively short sort of presentation, and try to capture those main insights plus some of those more pertinent and practical takeaways. We've got more work to do on this, and in terms of the data analysis to dive even deeper, and certainly things like stratifying by different levels of or certainly important impact in factors such as having children at home is something we do have within the data set, and it's something we're acutely aware that those sorts of things are going to have a big impact. So there's more work to be done, and I suppose keep an eye out for things that will continue to come from this data set.
Thanks, Josh. Tim has asked, do you aggregate data by way of female versus male? Historically, this has always been an issue, and wonder if skews data, particularly findings around distractions at home.
Yeah, so from a demographic perspective, we've got again, to Monica's question, some data there which we can use. Males and females isn't something which we did look at. I think it's I suppose a contentious topic potentially, and something which you can sort of get into the data one way or the other, but it wasn't something that we focused on. I think some of the other demographic variables which we would be more kind of focused on would be potentially age, job type and responsibilities, type of work that employees were performing, and looking to, I suppose, focus sort of the insights around those sorts of factors really. So I suppose to Tim's question, we haven't got and didn't focus on anything male female in this data set particularly.
Perfect. Paul, I'll ask you, did the environment influence performance?
Yeah, so Josh touched on it around desirability. One of the obviously issues, I suppose, that we had with home working was when we're in an office environment, we work with employees and employers that have office environmental sensors that give us some really accurate measures of lighting quality and noise levels and temperature, etc. When everyone moved to the home, we obviously didn't have that luxury, so we use subjective self-reporting. So employees, when they undertook the cognitive performance tests, outlined to us how they felt from an environmental perspective. So they gave us an overview of how they felt their lighting was, the temperature, and there were some links between things like comfortable temperature, showing a better performance, being in a slightly loud environment showed better performance on some of the cognition tests. So we had that and so in air quality again was shown as being impactful on cognitive performance. So from the subjective readings, yes, it did have an influence. I think moving forward, one of our aims in the coming months is to develop our technology so we can track some of those environmental features in a more objective manner, so we can be a little bit more confident around the quality of the data that we're collecting in that regard.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. And I think there's most questions covered. There's just one other. Have you gathered further data around desirability post full lockdown, and have people's employee feedback shifted as they've worked from home for several months?
Yeah, so that's something we've looked at and sort of overlaid from some of the objective sources. That I suppose COVID timeline and seeing how the changes in those, to Paul's point, the macro factors have impacted things. And you certainly, again, as Paul mentioned, you can certainly see that there was an impact of that. So the sort of continual monitoring across that period has been interesting in that sense. I think from the sort of the change and the desirability and those sorts of things, obviously we're talking about 8 weeks here that were sort of, I suppose, slightly shifted it backwards, where the majority of that was in a relatively full lockdown period. I think those insights, now are and again, to Paul's point, to keep mentioning him, and now those really key time, because we will start to see a situation which is certainly more normal, as much as we can use that word, and by doing that, we'll see those impacts. So, with children in the home, maybe they're now going back to school. Working situations and routines and working schedules could be getting back to some sort of normality. So the impact of those sorts of things on how desirable people feel that they can work from home, and also how accustomed they get to that. So there might be things that actually employees have, and even employers have done to actually try and mitigate against some of these things. So I'm sure that if you go to IKEA, they'll be fairly sold out of home working desks and desk chairs and potentially even monitors and things like this. So I think as we move, it's only natural that people will tend to try and help their own environment. So we could see, to Tim's point, we could see that over time things do shift potentially in the right direction. But then on the equal side of that, as time goes on, I think one of the things is the always on phenomenon. So are people now using that commute time? They were using it maybe for a bit of extra sleep. Maybe now they're actually using it to do a bit of extra work. Are lunchtime shifting? Are people just sedentary, as we showed, for long periods of the day? Is that sort of 5:30 finish time now rolling into slightly later in the day, a bit more difficult to switch off? So it's just so key to keep going with it, really. We just don't know, and until we have the data, we won't know. So I think to Tim's point there, it is going to change. We've already seen that, but continuing to measure and understand is so important from now on.
Great, thanks a million, Josh. And finally, just in the interest of time, I might finish off this last question. I'll pass it to you, Paul. Are there any issues with GDPR or / limitations on the data you can publish?
Well, now again, as Josh touched on earlier, everything we do complies with all GDPR and privacy guidelines, and as he mentioned, we work very closely with privacy teams in that regard. Obviously, when we work with particular clients, we can't publish their data without agreement with them, and we have done some scientific journals with different clients that we've worked with, and there's some white papers that are about to come out with another client we've worked with. So when it's a client project, we're very much driven by the client in terms of what they are happy for us to divulge publicly. When it's our own project like this has been, obviously we're free to talk about the data, but we obviously have to make sure that we're fully GDPR compliant, hence why we don't use any PII and keep everything fully anonymized throughout the process.
Perfect. Great, Paul, thank you very much. And yeah, I think we'll just leave it there for now in the interest of time, but any unanswered questions will be answered in written format and email once we send out the recording of this webinar.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mary. And as Mary said, we've slightly gone over, so apologies for that. I hope everyone's found the insights interesting. Thanks for your questions and your time. If you would like to get in touch, please don't hesitate to contact me. You can see my email address on the screen or via the website. And as I said earlier in the presentation, in the next week, we'll send out a recording of this webinar so you can watch it again in your own time or share it with any colleagues. And thanks again for your time. We'll leave it at that. Thank you.